think the first step in recognizing Indigenous and local as well as traditional knowledge is for the national government of South Africa to take responsibility for supporting and funding research on IKS. Presently, that knowledge is being supported, but I don't think it's being supported sufficiently. And then secondly, I really believe that since South Africa is now nearly 30 years past its first democratic elections, that there needs to be concerted effort to ensure that researchers and scholars, as well as South Africans, ordinary South Africans, get to know Africa better. And the only way to do this is, as the ancient travel writer and pilgrim Ibn Battuta said, we need to travel in search of knowledge. So South Africans from all walks of life need to be given the opportunity to go beyond the country's borders in order to encounter Indigenous and local knowledge in all of the African contexts that we have. Well, we inherited a curricula that is forged elsewhere. So in essence, the knowledge that we are encouraged to learn really doesn't come from South Africa's Indigenous communities, nor does it come from the African continent or its nearby diaspora. If we look at the curricula today, it is very generic knowledge that we have, and most of that knowledge is about terrestrial knowledge or what happens on land. It doesn't really consider human relations with the sea. So I feel it's quite important as an NRF chair in Ocean Cultures and Heritage that the Department of Basic Education and also Higher Education give more priority to advancing knowledge and education with regard to the sea. Once we have that, and once we have support of research as well in that regard, we can then see some of that knowledge basically filtering into the school curricula. Of course, it's always important to have champions in this regard. And this is where the graduate students come into play, because they can share their nascent research or their research in progress by going to the various schools in the Eastern Cape Province as a starter, in order for principals and head teachers to basically get to know about this content. So in that sense, it could be integrated, that knowledge could be integrated into the additional curricula. So in the South African educational curriculum specifically, I think if we look at there are two areas. I mean, having children of my own in the South African educational system, there are probably two areas where I think it's important to include this maritime knowledge and where it can be rectified. So obviously in natural sciences, we teach it as almost a culture neutral domain, that all science is the same. But actually, when we consider Indigenous knowledge, we find that there are very particular perspectives of how nature works and where to source important medicines and where to source important understanding about social ecological systems. So we really need to look at natural science as a subject that requires, I would say, a sort of decolonization for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge systems and what we call the vernacular archive. And then the other space where I think it can be addressed is in the social sciences, because our social sciences curricula, from what I gather, is still looking at important historical events that have taken place in Europe and have affected the European continent. So in essence, when we think about the Second World War, that is the curricula that, these are really seminal global events which students need to understand, pupils need to understand, regardless of where they come from. But I also feel that there are important social events, that there are important Indigenous knowledge events which have taken place on the African continent and in South Africa, which we really have not given sufficient attention to. So looking at the history curricula, the natural science curricula, and then possibly also the LO curricula, the life orientation curricula, because there you will find Indigenous values and practices that could be shared with pupils so that they understand that our values that come from South Africa and from the African continent more broadly, that these values are also valuable.
One cannot govern the ocean without knowledge, and whoever doesn't have the knowledge cannot govern the oceans. The oceans belong to all of us, not just people, the classes, the interests that historically have governed the oceans in the past, but also the communities which today are increasingly taking their rightful place in the global environment. So we cannot possibly pretend to transform ocean governance without broadening our scope of knowledge, and that must inevitably include the knowledge of, for instance, African nations, indigenous communities all around the continent.
Actually, it is SAIMI that has initiated the work on maritime, indigenous and local knowledge as part of its think tank. So in that way, it is SAIMI that is taking the leadership in promoting this work, in disseminating the work around that, in mobilizing stakeholders around this, and making the university a leader in this work. So SAIMI is real in the forefront, thinking about it, but also implementing it. Today's roundtable was exploring the possibility of establishing a university-wide platform on indigenous knowledge, indigenous and local knowledge. And this was made possible because through the work of SAIMI, we identified that the university has a strength in indigenous and local knowledge. But also we identified that there is also further strength in maritime, indigenous and local knowledge. We have two research chairs, NRF research chairs that do work in this area, but the campus is also designated as an ocean campus. And we do have other departments, like the development studies department, where they are also pushing on with work on indigenous knowledge. So thinking about the strengths of this indigenous knowledge, SAIMI conceived of creating a platform. But what would the platform be if it was only around the work of SAIMI? So the thinking was that we should then broaden this. So SAIMI decided to help in broadening the work on indigenous knowledge to go across the university. And then the work on maritime indigenous will be one of the hubs within the bigger platform. So we're hoping that in this way we can be reinforcing and keeping on fertilization of the ideas across the two platforms. So we expect that for SAIMI's work, it will grow into a national platform around maritime indigenous knowledge, but it will also become a continental platform. So in that way, SAIMI will be living true to its vision of becoming a leading institution in maritime studies within the African context.
So I I don't think interdisciplinary, I think transdisciplinary research, where we're actually engaging with stakeholders and Indigenous knowledge holders outside of academia. That is really where I see things and going in terms of it's not housed within the institution. I don't think it's engaging with the actual knowledge holders and seeing how they feel about things and the knowledge that they have, and it's about co-creating that knowledge in order to better take that up and understand how people understand their realities and their world.